And again, I'd like to welcome everybody to our 104th episode of the Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series. My name is Benji Cohn with the Minnesota DNR, Work in Fish and Wildlife Outreach Section. I'm joined today by Kevin Kenow, who formerly worked for the USGS as a head loon researcher. Still, you said you're a retired scientist now, still doing this, but I look forward to hearing your presentation and learning more about this, Kevin. So welcome.
Thanks a lot, Benji. It's really great to be here today. I remember becoming quite amazed at loons growing up as a young child. We vacationed in northern Minnesota near Hackensack, Longville area, and I was amazed at loons and at listening to their calls at night. It struck an interest with me, and one that I pursued, to where I was able to do some research on loons. So most of you are probably familiar with loons. They're iconic in northern Minnesota lakes, both in sight and sound. And the breeding adults are relatively easy to identify, easily confused with other birds. They've got the black iridescent head, red eye, thick bill, a black and white checkered pattern on their back. And they're one of 5 species of loons. They're the only loon that breeds in Minnesota, though. So today I'm going to cover some basics of common loon ecology and share some findings concerning migration ecology that from studies that we've done with the USGS, and then touch a bit on current loon conservation efforts in Minnesota. Let's mention that the common loon's a long life species, known to oldest individuals are 35 plus years of age based on banding records. They have a delayed maturity, that their first breeding is at an estimated age of between 4 and 11 years, and they have a relatively low lifetime reproductive performance. So the primary breeding range of common loon in North America includes freshwater habitats throughout the boreal forest and northern hardwood forest regions. And it's estimated that the adult population consists of about 636,000 individuals, with most of them occurring in Canada, and only about 6% occur in the United States. Alaska and Minnesota share both contain about 32% of that population. And there's also about 1% that breed in Greenland and Iceland. Of the proportion of loons in the United States, about 50% are thought to occur in the Great Lakes states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. I want to point out this line here. This indicates the former southern extent of their breeding range, which included northern Iowa, northern Illinois, Indiana, and to the east. And since the late 1800s, early 1900s, that southern range has shifted northward to where you see the current southern extent of their breeding range. About 70% of the population winters along the Gulf of Mexico and South Atlantic coast, and the other 30% over along the Pacific coast. So breeding loons are highly territorial, and they return to the same territory year after year if they're able to successfully fend off challenges of intruding loons. There's constantly younger loons that are looking to make their way into an existing territory. So they're often fights to the death even of loons trying to maintain their territory. In a typical year, breeding loons tend to arrive back on their territory shortly after ice out. And of course, this varies with the timing of ice out. In a typical year, they'd probably get there a few days after ice out. But since, like for this year, the ice out is expected to be about 2 weeks later than normal. So loons will often be back on the lake the day of ice out or the day after ice out. They often use open river systems near their breeding lakes and will take daily flights out to check the ice conditions so they can get back on territory as soon as possible. So most of them are back on territories by the end of the April. And should expect to see them shortly here in where I'm at near La Crosse, Wisconsin. So loons are well adapted for aquatic life, but they're really awkward on land. Their legs are set back on their body. They're adapted for, they're strong swimmers, but awkward on land. So the nests are typically located right on the water, so they can have easy access on and off the water. And they're constructed of residual vegetation that's mounted up to create a nest bowl. Here it's pictured in a sedge tussock. So the lake-rich forest areas of northern Minnesota illustrate the primary breeding landscape of loons. Female typically lays 2 eggs at a 1-day interval. And first nesting attempts generally occur by mid to late May in a typical year. The eggs are olive color to light brown and have dark brown or black spots. Incubation period's about 28 days, and both the female and male share in the incubation duties. The chicks dry within a few hours of hatch. And in the case of 2 eggs, which is the typical clutch size, a 2-egg clutch, the first chick is usually brooded on the nest and may occasionally enter the water and be tended by one of the adults. The second egg will hatch usually within 24 hours. And then once both chicks leave the nest, they rarely return to the nest. And both the adult male and female share in caring for the chicks. They provide size appropriate prey items. Initially, they might be invertebrates such as dragonfly larvae or leeches and small fish. This is a site maybe you've been lucky enough to observe chicks riding on the back of parents when they're very, very young, usually less than a week of age. And this aids the chicks in thermal regulation and also provides shelter from underwater predators such as snapping turtles or large fish. So common loons are well adapted for foraging on fish. And I've got a video here that illustrates a captive reared loon capturing rainbow trout. The edge of their mandibles are really sharp, and they have rearward pointing sharp denticles on the roof of their mouth and tongue that aid in grasping and retaining the fish. But you notice it manipulates the fish, turns it, and swallows it head first. They propel themselves through the water using just their feet. Young chicks have a voracious appetite. They can consume up to 50% of their body mass by the time they're a week of age. And this results in a very rapid growth rate, such that they're nearly feathered and fully grown by the time they're 11 to 12 weeks of age. 3,500 grams here is about 7.7 pounds. I'll talk a little bit about breeding season food habits. I'm going to introduce this with this video. This video depicts an impressive feat of an adult loon downing a white sucker that is about 15 inches in length. This was filmed on Agnes Lake in northeast Minnesota, Cook County. You can see the chicks there saying that's not size appropriate food for me. But yeah, this was a meal for this adult. You can see how distended its neck is as it swallows that down. So loons feed primarily on fish, although they also feed on invertebrates, crayfish, and other invertebrates, also amphibians, but most feed on perch and sunfish. And we did a study on the whitefish chain of lakes several years ago, and found that, as was the case there as well, loons fed primarily on perch and sunfish early in the season, or during most of the breeding season, May through August. And along with a number of other fish such as bass, northerns, crappies. But then as we got into August, we noticed the shift to consuming more cisco, whitefish, and mimic shiners were also important. There were 15 species of fish that we documented in fecal samples of loons. We also were looking at aggregations of loon, foraging aggregations of 35 to 80 loons feeding on the whitefish chain of lakes. And it was interesting that these large groups of loons were attracted to the area. And we found that they were feeding on cisco and mimic shiners. And it's well known that cisco are an oil-rich, high-energy food. They contribute to elevated growth rates in predator fish. And aggregations of loons have been observed on a number of cisco lakes in northern Minnesota, including lakes within the whitefish chain of lakes. So cisco may provide a critical food source for common loons as they prepare for fall migration. It's going to just run through a few of the calls of the common loons, calls synonymous with the northern lake wilderness. And there are 4 basic calls. The first is a tremolo, which is a signal alarm and signals distress. It's often heard at night, and it's the only call it's used while in flight. Next call is a wail, which is used during interactions. Mates often use that call to maintain contact with one another. And there's even one signal that of the wail that is heightened anxiety. And often if you hear that call, you'll often see a eagle just breaking above the horizon, and the loons pick up on that quickly. Eagle is one of their arch enemies. The yodel is a call that's produced only by the male, and it's used in territorial defense. And it even carries information about the loon's size and condition. And that may be used to communicate to other loons to say, stay out of my territory, I'm here defending it. And then finally, a hoot, which is used by loons in close proximity. So how are loon populations doing in Minnesota? Well, the Minnesota Loon Monitoring Program was initiated in 1994 to track changes in the state's loon population. 6 index areas were established, each consisting of 100 lakes. Up here in Cook and Lake County, Itasca County, Becker, Ottertail, Aiken, Crow Wing, and down here in the southwest in Candy-Ojai County. And generally, populations have been stable since between 1994 and 2020. There are marginal increases in the Ottertail index area, illustrated here with this trend line, and marginal decreases in the Cook Lake index area and in the Itasca index area. There's also been a drop in the percentage of occupied lakes in Cook Lake index area, but there's been a significant increase in number of lakes occupied in Candy-Ojai County. So there's a number of threats that common loons face during the breeding season. Chief among these are entanglement in fishing line and lures that can incapacitate the birds, and ingestion of lead tackle, which leads to lead poisoning. Just this drop shot in the palm of this person's hand was enough to kill this loon. This was from Wisconsin. So as the lead enters the system, the blood system, it may lead to death within 2 to 4 weeks. So lead toxicosis in loons affects the nervous system and leads to weakness, immobility, and ultimately death of the bird. Lead poisoning is accounted for 11 to 49% of documented mortality among studies nationally, and has been found in up to 20% among loons recovered in Minnesota. So ingested lead's both obtained from fishing activity, where it eats a fish that has ingested tackle or tackle trailing from it, and also picks up tackle from lake substrates. When it's mistaken for grit, they pick up to help grind food in their gizzard. And this has consequences to populations. In New Hampshire, lead tackle mortality resulted in a 43% reduction in the statewide population over a 24-year period. Other common threats to loons during the breeding season include nest abandonment, when black fly emergence corresponds with incubation. Hopefully you can be able to see this. The head of this loon is covered with black flies. They'll actually drive them off their nest, and if they're off the eggs too long, it may result in abandonment. Loss of nesting habitat with shoreline development is a big issue with breeding habitat loss. Also changing water levels, both dropping water levels and sudden rises of water associated with rainstorms can flood out nests. And then, of course, predation. Again, their arch enemy, the bald eagle. Bald eagles will take loon eggs, loon chicks, and have even been known to kill adult loons on the nest. There's a number of avian diseases, including West Nile virus, avian malaria, and aspergillosis, which takes a share of breeding loons, and contaminants such as petroleum products and mercury. Another threat, particularly during migration, is avian botulism. And it's a concern about loons using the Great Lakes. Botulism leads to paralysis and death. It's caused by ingestion of neurotoxin produced by Clostridium botulinum. There are a number of different types of botulism. Type C and type E are ones that are associated with waterbird die-offs. But periodic outbreaks of type E botulism have occurred on the Great Lakes, primarily Lake Michigan and Erie, since at least the 1960s, and it was quite common and widespread during 1999 through 2014. There's a variety of waterbirds that are at risk to type E botulism. But as shown in this graphic, of 50,000 birds, estimated mortality attributed to type E botulism, half, or about 25,000, were common loons. So common loons are a much at-risk species to avian botulism. The prevalence of die-offs varies across years. It's often associated with years of warmer lake temperature, lower water levels. Fortunately, since about 2015, lake levels in the Great Lakes have risen again, and I haven't heard as much about avian botulism die-offs since about 2015. So how does botulism make its way into common loon? Well, the spores are dormant and they're commonly found in the sediments of the Great Lakes. And when they're exposed to a suite of environmental conditions, including elevated water temperatures, anoxia, and a protein source such as decaying organic matter, which might be green, case of Great Lakes, Cladophora, the green algae, or invertebrates. Predators mobilize the toxin, and it makes its way up the food chain, ultimately to round gobies, and which are fed on by common loons and long-tailed ducks. And another big issue that you've no doubt heard about, it's a Deepwater Horizon oil spill. In 2010, the well exploded, causing loss of life and extensive natural resource injury. The oil spread from the deep ocean to the surface and nearshore environment from Texas to Florida. And given the likely wintering distribution of common loons breeding in the upper Midwest, coupled with the occurrence of the spill, concern about the effect of the spill on wintering loons was expressed by resource managers. So impact of oil spills on loons and other seabirds has both direct and indirect effects. Direct exposure interferes with waterproofing insulation and leads to hypothermia and death. And ingestion from oil from water, food, and during preening of their feathers also exposes birds to polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which are known carcinogens, and effects include physiological and behavioral changes. There are a number of debilitating sublethal effects, including starvation, disease, and predation that arise from exposure to oil. So we undertook a study of common loon migration beginning in 2010. And as nice as it sounds to be able to interview loons on Florida beaches, we instead used a couple of unique technologies to study loon migration. Project objectives addressed migration-related information needs to assess loon distribution and foraging characteristics, to assess pathways of botulism exposure in the Great Lakes, and the Minnesota DNR concerns related to potential injury incurred to the Minnesota breeding population as a result of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. We use satellite telemetry to track migrations of radiomarked loons. These are the radio packages here. We planted these transmitters in 31 adult male loons. They're an abdominal implant with this external whip antenna. And this is necessary because it's found that external transmitter attachment packages don't work well with loons and other diving birds. Harness attachments are sometimes used for ducks, but the harness itself will separate the feathers and irritate the bird as water is able to get through to the skin. So we went with an implant technique. They were surgically implanted by a trained veterinarian. The loon is under a general anesthetic, and it's necessary for the external antenna because it needs to transmit a signal that's received by a polar orbiting satellite. It's actually a receiver on board a weather satellite 528 miles above the Earth, hence the need for the external antenna. So we programmed these to get most of the data during fall migration and spring migration when it would transmit for 8 hours on and then turn off for 24 hours. Now we also used a device called an archival geolocator tag, pictured here. It's a little bit smaller than a AAA battery. We attached it to a leg band. And it produces a location estimate, a daily location estimate, with latitude and longitude, based on measures of sunrise, the sunset, day length, and solar noon. And the tags also record temperature. And a really unique thing is they record pressure data, which allows us to look at dive patterns of individual loons. So adult loons were radio marked and geotagged across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Upper Peninsula, illustrated here. We captured the loons using a night lighting technique, illustrated here, which involves close teamwork among a crew of 3, the boat driver, someone holding a high-powered spotlight, and the netter. And this technique works really well with adults that have chicks, as the adults tend to stay up on the surface. The bright light kind of obscures us, and so they aren't quite sure what's behind the light, and we're able to move up on the birds and scoop them up. We also used a lift net technique. In this case, there's a net underneath the water, and we've got a decoy loon here. This is placed in the loon's territory. The adult loon comes in, we lift the net up, and the loon is captured within this corral. And this provides us an opportunity to catch loons during the pre-nesting season. So the movement data from our radio marked loons were served on a website that we established to provide information to project partners and the public. And what I'm going to show now is an animation that displays the movements of radio marked adult loons. Those banded in 2010 are these, and the red dot were marked in 2010, and the yellow dot was marked in 2011. And so as this animation proceeds, the date will display here. Just see where the corresponding locations are to date. Here we go. So you can see, even in early August, we've got some movement of birds over to Green Bay. As we move into September, we start getting more movement, especially late September, early October. And we see a lot of movement over to the Lake Michigan, primarily Green Bay, northern Lake Michigan. Some birds moved on to Lake Huron and Lake Erie. And you'll notice some of the birds in Lake Michigan start moving to the south end of the lake. Now we're in early November, and they begin their migration to wintering areas. Most of the birds move down to the Gulf of Mexico, a number of them along the South Atlantic coast. And then as we get into winter, they tend to occupy a small area. They don't move around too much. During several weeks during the winter, they're flightless as they replace their primaries. So here we are at February, late February now. And about March 18th, we got our first bird begin its migration northward. You notice that the migration is relatively rapid compared to the migration during the fall, when birds spent quite a bit of time on Lake Michigan. They're anxious to get back to their territories. And in the case of these 2 years, by May 10th, most of the birds were back on territory. So we got a couple birds down here that we lost signals on, but by May 10th, they were all back. So just kind of a recap, the generalized movement, certainly Lake Michigan is important. 96% of our birds that we've marked used Lake Michigan during fall migration. And distance here is about 250 to 400 miles from Minnesota loon breeding area. And so they're in Lake Michigan and before they moved on to their wintering areas. We looked at the distribution of radio marked loons. I was really surprised to see that they were located in deep waters and quite a ways from shore. On average, water depth was about 100 feet, and they were on average 6.5 miles from shore. And if you look at these depth contours, they're in this 20 to 40 meter depth contour down here, which is about 60 to 130 feet. So it was interesting that they were using these offshore deep areas. When we look at the dive characteristics of the loons, we find that they were actually diving quite deep. Average depth of dive was 50 to 75 feet and maximum depth of nearly 200 feet. Average dive duration was 69 to 90 seconds, and that was related to depth of dive. The deeper they dove, the longer the dive duration, and also the time at the bottom. The deeper they dove, the longer they spent on the bottom. We get some interesting look at descent rate. The average descent rate was 3.5 feet per second, and ascent rate was 5.3 feet per second. As I mentioned, the pressure data from the geolocator tags allowed us to look at the profiles of individual dives. And so pictured here in the upper part of the graph are dives over the course of a day. And you'll see several periods of diving followed by rest. And if we zoom in on this 30-minute segment, you can see it's composed of dives that were down to nearly 130 feet repeatedly, back up to the surface, on the surface for a while, repeated down to 130 feet. And they made the series of repeated dives to this consistent depth. Well, the dives characterized by this long duration at maximum depth relative to the entire dive, which occurred in 82% of the dives, are termed square shape or U-shaped in the penguin and sea mammal dive literature. And this type of pattern is indicative of benthic feeding, where they're feeding on the bottom, hence the consistent depth of dive. So what does this indicate? Benthic feeding, there's forage trawling data that suggests there's an abundance of prey fish present at these depths that the loons were foraging at, including round goby. And we also know that from an earlier study that round gobies were the dominant prey found in gut contents of carcasses collected at Lake Michigan. Another thing we saw was the spatial pattern of common loons corresponds to where there are higher densities or a biomass of bracidid mussels, both primarily quagga mussel, but also zebra mussels. So it was reasonable to assume that the gobies were foraging over these beds of zebra mussels, and that loons then exploited these gobies at these locations. So this transfer of botulism neurotoxin may occur in these deep water habitats in Lake Michigan. Once they departed Lake Michigan, most of the birds, 80% of them, went to the Gulf of Mexico for wintering, about 16% to the Atlantic Ocean, and another 4% to reservoirs in the southeastern United States. Here's a timeline, the day of year across the bottom. So as we saw, they departed breeding lakes in August, most of them departing by late October. They're arriving in Lake Michigan throughout the fall, and then departing in the end of November. As they moved south, they did stop at some southeast reservoirs, central state lakes, but those where they're spending about 27 days on Lake Michigan on average. They're spending just a few days on these other areas as they move to the wintering ground. They're there by end of November, early December, where they spend the next 4 months. There are a number of stops documented at several lakes and reservoirs in Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, the Carolinas, Alabama, and Georgia. So wintering adult loons primarily used offshore waters, so the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean, usually associated with water depths of 65 to 130 feet. And dive data from geolocator tags indicated loons, as was the case in Lake Michigan, were foraging at or near benthic zones in the Gulf. Among Minnesota loons, 95% of the loon locations were more than 5.5 miles offshore, and half of them will occur over 24 miles offshore. So note the location of these loons with respect to the continental shelf here. So we look at with respect to the area of the Gulf of Mexico impacted by the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the adult loon, radio-marked loons were in Florida waters to the east of the 2010 surface oil footprint. But there are other wintering birds that are in this oil spill area. And we know also from some of our work we did on juvenile loons that they will winter off the Louisiana, Texas, and even down into the Mexico coast. And then spring migration. So I've indicated here March 22nd. So you can kind of picture where the loons are right now. Some of them have already departed their wintering area. They'll be, and I looked at eBird a couple days ago. I know there was a loon sighted in a lake in southern Wisconsin. So the migration is rapid in the spring relative to the fall, but of course it's conditional on what the ice out conditions are on the breeding lakes. So in a year like this spring, where we're expecting a late ice out in northern Minnesota, loons will probably pile up here like on the Mississippi River, or and we had radio-marked birds that would use the Mississippi River near St. Cloud while waiting for their territory to open up on Lake Saginaga on St. John campus. They'll also use the Great Lakes and then take these daily flights to assess what the ice conditions are on their breeding lakes. Okay, so just to summarize the migration, of course, breeding lakes are important in ensuring productivity of loons. We saw that adults had a lot of use of Lake Michigan. There is a threat to exposure to avian botulism for migrating loons on Lake Michigan. And we're not going to have time to go through the migration summary of juvenile loons, but we saw a delayed, more directed migration of juvenile loons, median of 7 days to get from their breeding area to the wintering area. Most of them winter in the same area, the Gulf of Mexico, and also a smaller proportion in the South Atlantic coast. The adult spring migration, they tend to get back to their breeding lakes as quickly as possible. We also found that adult males departed the Gulf of Mexico about 7 days earlier than the females. And this has been noted on arrival that there's usually the adult males would typically get there a few days before the females do. Just a thing about juveniles, they winter in the same location, but what we saw was that the juveniles would migrate up the Atlantic coast, and several of them wintered up or summered up in this area their first summer before returning to the same wintering area. Finally, I just wanted to touch on the loon restoration project that's underway in Minnesota. This is, there was the trustee council associated with the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, tallied 93 bird species killed, surpassing up to 100,000 individuals. The direct mortality rate for common loons ranged from 530 to 812 individuals, with additional lost productivity acknowledged for fledged loons due to mortality of breeding age adults. And so the project seeks to increase adult and chick survival in the upper Midwest. There are a number of restoration activities included in the project. One is acquisition or easement of lake shores to protect loon nesting habitat. The second is to enhance loon productivity by providing artificial nest platforms and engage lake associations in loon conservation activities. Loon platforms have been found to increase nest or hatching success by 67% and fledging success by 32%. So it seems to be an effective technique. And then the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency is running an Get the Lead Out program to encourage people to use lead, non-toxic fishing tackle and to reduce loon exposure to the lead-based fishing tackle. So just to acknowledge funding entities for this, the work we've done. There have been a number of federal agencies, state agencies, and NGOs involved in the work. And with that, if there's time, I'd be happy to take some questions. Hey, Benji, I'm unable to hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, gotcha.
Okay. I had two buttons on this headset. I must have hit the wrong one. So fantastic job. So lots of great information in there. I tried to share the links that you had, the migration thing, map, the PCA site, the Loon Center site, and the Loon Restoration Act. I put those in the chat. So if anybody's looking for those, they will be in the chat function there. We have a ton of questions. I'm going to just apologize now. We won't be able to get to all of them. Polling, though, if you want to click on the polling button at the bottom, we have a couple of polling questions there, just some fun stuff to share with us if you would. So we start out with our friend Maverick is back today. So he was asking, if loons get back to their territory so soon, how do first-year loons find territory without intruding on others?
Yeah, so I didn't cover that very well, but young loons don't breed until they're on average about 6 years of age. And so they will initially, after about 3 years of age or so, return to their breeding area, general breeding area, and start scoping out lakes. And so you've got this population of loons that are circulating the territories, testing territories, maybe challenging either adult males or females in those territories, trying to drive them out. and assessing which territories are of high quality. So this all goes on well after spring into summer. So initially, you're getting the territorial loons that have been established on territories in past years.
Great. Jody was wondering, and I'm not for sure if you gave a specific number, but do you know how many loons in Minnesota are tagged?
Banded. We do a lot of banding, and Dr. Walter Piper has also done some in recent years. So there's probably on the order of 250, 300 loons that have been banded. And we'll often use these plastic leg bands that are each loon receives a unique color combination, so we're able to identify that individual from a distance.
Oh, cool. And Caleb was wondering if there's been any research done about the impact of light pollution in loons.
Light pollution, that's a good question. I am not aware of any work that has looked at light pollution.
And Deb was wondering about finding the most loons at the moment, and I'm guessing they're still down south. I have not seen any. I'm kind of excited this year because we live along the St. Croix River, and we have a little lake that opens up kind of before the northern ice out happens. So we usually get half dozen loons that kind of settle around my area. So it's always fun to be able to watch them. But have you seen any in Minnesota yet?
I have not. We don't have any birds with radio tags on right now, so we aren't able to follow any. I suspect there are birds using Lake Michigan right now, lakes in southern Wisconsin, and I tend to see loons here on Lake Unalaska, which is near La Crosse, Wisconsin. Earliest I think has been about the 26th of March. So within the next week, I should be seeing them out here.
They're coming, getting ready. So we had quite a few questions actually on the nesting platforms. So yeah, I get a little bit of experience because I got to pick a nesting platform up from you and put on a nearby lake up here, which is kind of cool. One question was, do they work? I think you said in there the effectiveness of those. I think you might have said 62% increase in.
There's a study done in Wisconsin, and the nest success improved by 67%, and I think overall fledging rate of chicks increased by 32%, something on that order.
And I know Deborah was asking about, they have eagles on their lakes also. Are they doomed to lose their loons? And I know we had with the nesting nest we put out here, ended up putting a cover over it kind of to help deter the eagles a little bit. So there's things you can do, huh?
There are eagle guards that are often attached to nest platforms, or even I've seen a Quonset hut style where there's a canopy over the nesting platform and the ends are open for the birds to get in and out. So that deters avian predators.
Great. Janet, we'll provide a link to the recording. There was one in the chat. Holly was asking, loon breeding habitat could shrink due to climate change. Is there any estimates or comments, research that you've seen that how much that might shrink and if Minnesota's in danger of losing our loons?
Yeah, I've heard some dire projections, but for the most part, over the past 20 years or so, they've held their own in the upper Midwest. In the case of Wisconsin, I showed that previous southern extent of their loon range down into Illinois. Well, that's shifted northward, but it's actually shifted a bit southward. In the 1960s, loons began occupying reservoirs associated with cranberry growing operations in central Wisconsin. And so now there's a population of 50 or so breeding pair in that area. There also seems that, as a good indication, if you look at the Minnesota Loon Monitoring Program data, Kenow County, which was the southernmost of the index areas, showing occupancy of lakes increasing in that area. So There are a lot of things that could be impacting loons associated with climate change, both from the standpoint of disease vectors being uh, shifting and maybe impacting breeding loons up here. Um, don't know what the timing of migration and association with black fly hatches, how that might be influenced by climate change. And then there's also, if you look at a loon as it's incubating, you often see it's panting. So it does get warm there. And so I'm not sure just what they will tolerate in terms of temperature regime for during incubation. That's certainly something that needs to be looked at.
Interesting. A couple more questions from Kate, and Christy had similar questions here. He was wondering, sometimes in early summer mornings, all 15 to 20 loons gathered on their lakes, kind of like they're meeting for coffee. By mid-morning, they seem to have returned to their lakes, and a few native pairs that hang out, but it's very cool. But what's going on here? And Christy has a similar question with 4 to 6 individuals. Are they young loons or older loons, or what do you suspect?
So later in the summer, loons tend to gather these social gatherings, and it's proposed that it could be a means of assessing territory status within a lake. It could be an opportunity for them to forage on a social basis. And in the case of later in the summer, as Cisco become more vulnerable, as is the case of the whitefish chain of lakes, it provides a foraging opportunity. So you get groups of birds beginning to forage together. Those types of gatherings tend to occur in neutral areas of the lake, not necessarily associated with a territory. The pair will probably get quite upset and tend to defend their territory against gatherings of loons. But short answer is social gatherings, and also perhaps an opportunity for foraging opportunities as a group.
Oh, yeah. Jody and Antoinette had similar questions here also, talking about down in Florida. Do they stay in the water all the time, or do they ever go on land or near shore when they're wintering? And the red tide's been a common thing down in Florida the last several years. Does that have any effect on our loons?
So loons, even on their wintering grounds, are primarily in the water. If they're on a beach, there's probably something wrong with them. They're suffering from some malady. And there are a number of issues with the loons on wintering grounds as well as breeding grounds. They are subject to shifts in forage availability. They could be upset by storms. They're a sight feeder, so they require rather clear water for foraging. So if you get sediments stirred up during a storm, it may impinge on foraging activity. They could be subjected to disease or parasites. There's an emaciation syndrome that occurs with loons, and we saw this with our juvenile loons. We tended to lose a lot of loons during spring migration. They did fine during the winter, but it seemed like there was a shift in forage availability that they couldn't handle. And as they move their way up the Atlantic coast, there tends to be a lot of die-offs along the North Carolina coast, and most of the birds that wash ashore are emaciated or in poor condition. Red tide certainly is a contributing factor to loon mortality. It's toxins produced during algal blooms, which can affect humans as well in terms of understanding, can be very irritating to people that are on the beach as this blows off the coast. But loons are subject to that as well. One of their predators that they have well on the wintering grounds are sharks. And, we did have a a bird of ours that turned up on a beach in Florida that had injuries consistent with a shark attack.
Wow. A couple biological questions for me. Amy was wondering, how do you tell the difference between male and female loons? And also somebody asked about ducks and loons, the correlation there. And I know the coots and loons are their own, not ducks family, but maybe you can clarify that a little bit too.
Yeah, loons are in their own family, Gavidae, and which separated off quite a while ago in time from the waterfowl, the ducks and geese that we know. Loons are more closely related to grebes and cormorants, but in terms of differentiating between male and female, they both appear alike. Coloring is the same, but the male tends to be about 25% larger than the female. So if you see them side by side, a pair side by side, usually tell the male from the female. And then the other clue is it's the male that yodels. So see a loon yodeling, you'll know that's a male.
Tim asked a question on his lake. Seems to be more loons appearing each year, and they become kind of more friendly. And somebody else was asking that, are they naturally kind of curious? They follow canoes up in the boundary waters sometimes, or when you're out kind of paddling around, are they kind of a naturally curious bird?
There's a lot of variation from individual to individual. I've done a lot of nest searching, and there are lakes I've gone to, and as soon as I slip my canoe off the vehicle and put it in the water, they disappear. On other cases, I've canoed or boated right up to the loon and to check eggs or something, or measure eggs, and actually can lift the loon off the nest to get the egg and do the measurements. Bird, if it got off, it'll crawl back on. I have to push it off again. And they're very tolerant. So there's a wide range. And often there are instances where loons will nest on public beaches. And so it requires people to close the beach for a while to not disturb them. So a lot of variation among individuals.
We had a few questions on here about the size of a territory of a loon.
Yeah, so the loon has, it varies. On lakes that are small, say less than 60 acres in size, they may have more than one lake that makes up its territory. So they may nest on a small lake, but later on they will actually move their chicks across overland to a larger lake nearby where they will forage. There's also a whole lake territory where one pair will have a territory that encompasses the entire lake. That's usually maybe the lake is 60 to 200 acres in size. And then usually lakes greater than 200 acres in size are multi-territory lakes. You can have just a separation by bays. It seems like as long as there's a visual separation, you can stack a number of territories within the larger lakes.
Great. And we're out of time. I get one last question here because I think it's an important one. Is Angie was asking about nesting platforms, how might get one, and lake associations, how might they get involved in protecting loons? Do you have any tips, words, advice, I guess?
Yeah, I guess the quickest answer is to go to the Minnesota DNR Loon Restoration website and
linked in the chat.
Contact information there about some lake associations are already in contact with that project, and that might be an easy way to get information about how and where to put loon platforms in Minnesota.
Great. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for all your information. Thank you for everybody that hung on and we tried to get all the questions. If there's questions that people still have, do you mind if people reach out to you? And
By all means, maybe you could add my email contact information and they can get in touch with me directly.
sounds good. So if anybody wants that, we can get that to you. It'll also be in the recording also, which will be available on YouTube probably later today or tomorrow, and it'll be up on our website at minnesotadnr.gov/discover also. Until then, enjoy the nice weather. It's starting to warm up and be springtime out here, and Loons will be back soon, I hope. And next week, we will hope everybody can join us. We're talking about backyard bird feeding. So instead of water birds, we're going to talk about the birds in your backyard. So thanks again, Kevin. It was great. So.
Thanks. It was great to be with you. Bye.